Factory-built drag cars are some of the most fascinating machines that ever came out of Detroit, but the one we're talking about today isn't a car, it's actually a truck, and it's a 1963 Ford F-100 to be exact. This is the one and only factory-commissioned drag truck that came out of Ford Motor Company. So to tell the whole story on this truck, we got to back up a couple of years to see the factory involvement in NHRA drag racing. The stock eliminator classes would often showcase what a production model could do, and these classes were filled with rules that prevented any extreme modifications. And the factories got behind this because obviously if a Ford was winning on Sunday, they'd sell more of them on Monday. And the same could be said for General Motors, Chrysler Corporation, but Ford was definitely a front runner in factory involvement. They had special equipment that would put them within the rules package the NHRA put together, but some of these combinations were a little outside of the lines, so NHRA came up with a class called Factory Experimental, and that allowed the factories to obviously experiment a little bit, try a different engine combination, maybe not something that was exactly production ready, but something that had production type parts in it. And let's not confuse this version of Factory Experimental with the AFX classes from the mid-60s on. From 1965 and beyond, Factory Experimental was really just out of control and turned into what we now know as funny car racing. But before 1965, it was a whole different ballgame, and the factories were really getting behind it with some specially prepared cars. Ford, in the early 60s, started producing cars with lightweight body panels, big engines, special components from front to back. They were really getting behind this program. And in preparation for the 1963 drag racing season, they wanted to build a truck. So they commissioned a prototype be built by Dearborn Steel Tubing. Now DST is kind of a household name when it comes to old drag cars because they were the ones responsible for building the Ford Thunderbolt. Now before the Thunderbolt project came about, they built one 1963 Ford F-100 pickup truck. There has been some confusion as far as how many of these things were built, and let's get into that right now. So Andy Houghton, the guy who's in charge of Dearborn Steel Tubing, had actually built a 427 powered 62 F-100. Obviously, that came before this 63 model truck, but that's not to be confused with this F-100 XL because Andy's truck was just a personal truck. The F-100 XL was a factory commissioned drag truck. Later on, there were a couple of trucks that were similar to this, but again, they were built by different people. They were not factory commissioned. Dearborn Steel Tubing built another truck that was kind of like a shop truck. It had a 427 in it, but again, much more streetable than this drag truck. And then in 1964, Dave Lyle built a 64 F-100. That was 427 powered. It ran in B, factory experimental, but it was essentially taking the idea that the F-100 XL had and kind of building upon that for the 64 season. So let's go back to the 1963 season and tell the story of the F-100 XL. The F-100 XL was a project that took a $2,600 base model truck and added a $3,400 package on top of that. So you're talking about big money for this specially prepared drag truck. And what was involved in the DST conversion was a long list of items. It started with the front suspension. They changed out the springs for 1,100 pound front springs with 90-10 shocks. It's pretty revolutionary stuff in 1963, by the way. Out back it had 1,650 pound rear springs with 50-50 shocks, a 9-inch housing, a power lock differential with 486 gears. This thing had custom traction bars that were made out of giant Ford tie rod ends that came off of a heavy-duty Ford truck, and they actually went toward the back of the truck, where most traction bars you see now on leaf springs, like Caltrac bars for instance, they go to the front leaf spring perch. Well, these went to the rear of the truck and served the same purpose, where they just wanted to control that axle wrap. And another thing they did to try to control the axle wrap was they flipped the rear end housing to the other side of the springs, and not only did that lower the ride height, it also helped control some of that axle wrap. Let's keep in mind in 1963 that tire technology wasn't what it is today, and there was hardly any track prep. Basically, the only track prep you'd get was a broom sweeping some of the dust off of the surface. So weight transfer was a really big deal on these factory-produced cars and trucks. And in this case, they moved the fuel tank out of the cab and into the rear of the frame, behind the rear end housing. That put a little extra weight back there, and that was a custom 14-gallon tank. Now, you don't need 14 gallons to go drag racing. It's obvious that you only need a couple of gallons to make it through the pits, make it pass, make it back to your pit. But they put 14 gallons so that you had a little extra weight back there, helping any way they could to get some traction. They use M&H 915 slicks, and they mounted those to widened steel wheels. They're 15 by 8.5 inches. Up front, it had just some stock steel wheels and 670/15 bias-ply tires. The power plant for this truck was Ford's top dog at the time, the 427, 425 horsepower combination. It had a set of Bellinger-tuned headers on it, and it was backed by a T10 4-speed manual transmission. Some of the special things about the F-100 XL were the cosmetic details. This thing was not your standard Ford pickup truck, and it was partially created to help promote a special version of a factory truck that you could get. You could get bucket seats and a console. You could get some nice ornamental things, and it wasn't just all about performance. It was more of an appearance package. But as you'll notice on this truck, it had beige paint and it had a black vinyl top. It had red pinstripes. This truck was certainly built to be a showpiece and not just something that was getting beat up on the drag strip, even though they took this truck to 10 different drag strips to prepare it for the U.S. Nationals in 1963. But the idea with this 10-track tour was to work out all the bugs so that they could show up at Indy and compete with the field. Now, this truck, because of its weight of 3,825 pounds, and because of its cubic inches and horsepower rating, it put it into the B category of the factory experimental class. And of course, I have to mention that there were a few trucks in this class. The BFX class had a few Dodge trucks in competition. So of course, Ford wanted to get in the game and obviously outrun the Dodge boys. So this was going to be their piece to take to Indianapolis and compete against the Dodge boys and of course all the other cars in the factory experimental class. During this time, the truck was lettered with Stu Wilson Ford on the quarter panel areas, and they were based out of Dearborn, Michigan. And this was pretty normal back in the day to list a dealership with one of these factory produced cars, even though Stu Wilson Ford didn't necessarily have anything to do with the truck itself. So at this time, it was being driven by Jack Fuchs. Now, he went by the nickname Skinny, and he was an employee of Dearborn Steel Tubing. On the front fender, the names Wayne Feitzer and Don Heitz are listed as mechanics. During this 10-track test run, the truck's best ET in mile an hour happened at Detroit Dragway, and it was a 1272 at 108 miles per hour. Now, this is an interesting piece of literature. This is an ad that says, "Want a hot drag machine or a beautiful tow truck? It is now possible to order an F-100 pickup with a Galaxy XL bucket seat interior. Downtown Ford, Los Angeles, California." Well, Downtown Ford had nothing to do with this truck, the Stu Wilson truck. This was an advertisement to try to gain some interest on additional F-100 XL trucks being built, and that never happened. Now, this piece of literature tells you exactly what it takes to order an F-100 XL. Now, it starts with a base model F-100 pickup truck, 114-inch wheelbase, style side box, 223 six-cylinder engine, just your standard stuff. And then it gets sent to Dearborn Steel Tubing, who adds the 427, the 2.4s, the 4-speed, all of those custom items to make this thing a drag truck. And it says right here, Dearborn Steel Tubing Company's conversion price, $3,400. Now, that was on top of the purchase price of the truck. So this was a very expensive piece, and it's obvious that this thing didn't take off. There weren't any others produced in this exact configuration. So this truck's biggest potential moment was at the 1963 U.S. Nationals. This is where all the photographers were. This is where all the media coverage was going to happen. And this truck went to the line and made one pass that we know of. We see evidence right here from the starting line at Indianapolis. But this truck actually broke on the way to a magazine photo shoot and couldn't come back and compete. It was just a big letdown because this truck had so much potential. But at that point, that's kind of when the guys at DST let go of this truck. They stopped the continual testing, they moved on. At this point, the truck was sold for an undisclosed amount of money, and it went from Detroit to the state of Delaware. And the new owner, Jack Whitby, owned a Ford dealership called Friendly Ford in Wilmington, Delaware. This truck was sold to Jack Whitby with a bill of origin. It had no title whatsoever. The obvious concerns and liability reasons meant that this was just going to be a drag truck, and if anything, it were to be destroyed at the end of its life cycle. He bought this thing as a promotional piece to try to help spur some interest in this new XL product line that Ford was coming out with. And he took this thing out and raced it himself, and according to some of his literature, this thing made 17 starts and had 17 wins. It won at every single race it entered in the B factory experimental class. So all of this takes place in fall of 1963. The U.S. Nationals occurred in early September, and by November of 1963, this truck was listed for sale in the newspaper for a price of $3,295. And it says in the ad, built by the Ford Motor Company, experimental racing division at a cost of $15,000 with a minimum of modifications to the F-100 XL can be converted to run on the street. Contact Jack Whitby's Friendly Ford Sales, Wilmington, Delaware. Now, that's where the story gets a little bit fuzzy, because remember, this thing was sold to Jack Whitby without a title, and it was a race-only vehicle. So now we're at the end of the 1963 season, and this truck has already done a lot. It's seen a lot, it's done a lot, and it's now for sale by Jack Whitby. And Jack Whitby was actually one of the selected dealerships that had access to the Ford Thunderbolt, which was going to be coming out. It was a 64 Ford Fairlane, and this is the end of 63. So the guy who put down the deposit on the Thunderbolt that Jack Whitby ordered was Bill Naudain. Now, he allegedly sold 13 cows in order to put down this deposit on the Thunderbolt, and although I don't have proof of this, it would appear that Bill got a little bit impatient while waiting on that car to be delivered. And when the truck became available, he transferred his funds from the Thunderbolt deposit over to buy this truck. And he took the truck and raced it for a few years. He modified the truck to fit his liking. He had some health issues with his legs, so he couldn't do the 4-speed. He switched it over to an automatic and even put a 427 cammer in this truck at some point. Now, here's a really interesting picture. This is something that I just happened to stumble across, and it is a picture of the F-100 XL pulling a boat. So obviously Bill did drive this truck on the street. After it got done with his drag racing career, he put this thing back into street mode. And this truck, even though it was very special to him, he eventually parked it. He just put it in the shed. He moved on to tractor pulling. He moved on to other things. And this truck just remained in his garage. And part of the reason why this truck didn't come out and get displayed very often was because Bill started getting letters from Ford Motor Company about the 1963 Ford F-100 XL. They were looking for it. They didn't know that Jack Whitby had gotten a title for it. They didn't know all of these things had transpired, so they were looking for their truck. And probably not looking for it to own it necessarily, but probably just looking for it to be off the road. Bill keeps getting these letters, and he continues to ignore them because that's his truck. He bought it fair and square. He paid his hard-earned money for it. He got a title for it. It's in his name. So he keeps this truck for years and years and years. And it's just kind of one of those things that's a conversation piece. It's something he tells stories about his racing days, and obviously about this truck that Ford Motor Company wants back. It was a local legend, and it gained even more notoriety when Bill started bringing it back out into the public. And he did that because a friend of his, John Morris, helped him drag it out of the shed, get it cleaned up, get it running again, and put this thing back out in front of the public so that he could tell its story and he could kind of show it off, because this truck had been hidden away for so long that it was kind of a forgotten piece of Ford racing history. Unfortunately, Bill passed away a few years ago, and his good friend John Morris took ownership of this truck, and he's got all the great memorabilia to go with it, the documentation, and of course some trophies. One of these says Georgetown Dragway 1964, another one says NASCAR Spring Nationals, which happened in Richmond, Virginia at that time, 1966. So this truck raced at least until 1966, but that's about when things started fizzling out in Bill's drag racing career. And at the present day, this truck has 2,983 miles on it, and it is preserved wonderfully. You'll see the paint, the lettering, the interior, under the hood, everything is just like it should be and just like it was for so long. I had the opportunity to see this truck in person at the Grand National F-100 show in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, and this thing stood out of the crowd because you had all sorts of customized show trucks and lifted trucks, slam trucks, chop tops, all sorts of custom designs, but this thing stood out of the crowd, and it was certainly my favorite out of the whole bunch. But it had so much history and a lot of good documentation, and it, of course, as always, led me down a rabbit hole of research trying to figure out the exact history of this thing. And I had some help from Charlie Morris, who is a Ford racing fanatic. He's written books, he's written lots of articles about Ford drag cars, and I knew that he would be the authority when it came to information about this truck. And I used documentation like these magazine articles, these newspaper clippings, so I could tell you the full story on this extremely rare truck. And rare probably isn't even the right word to use for this. This is the only one. It's the only truck that Ford commissioned as a factory drag truck. Dearborn Steel Tubing built it, Ford Motor Company was in charge of it, and this thing was the only one that ever existed. Sure, there were 427 trucks that existed, but none were like this one.